Our podcast partner for this session is Launchora.
To all storytellers and story lovers, my name is Laksh Datta. I host and produce the Jaipur Bites podcast, where you can hear many of the amazing sessions from the Jaipur Literature Festival. I also produce a few other podcasts, as you can see right here. English, Hindi, fiction, non-fiction. If you see something you like, maybe you can take a screenshot of this right now. I'll give you a second. And tune in later. Find them on your favorite podcast app.
Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. From here, the Diggy Palace, from the front lawn. It's our pleasure to present today The Haunting of ALMA Fielding, a true ghost story. Kate Summerscale in conversation with Ira Mukhoty. Kate Summerscale's latest book, The Haunting of ALMA Fielding, is a gripping narrative that follows the investigation of supernatural experiences in the shadow of war and the unraveling of a story of trauma, loss, and alienation. Summerscale is also the author of bestsellers The Suspicion of Mr. Witcher and The Queen of Whale Cay. In conversation with historian and author Ira Mukhoty, Summerscale explores the 1930s case of the Croydon poltergeist and the hidden folds of the human mind. Kate Summerscale is the author of the #1 best-selling The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher. Her first book, the best-selling The Queen of Whale Cay, won a Somerset Maugham prize and was shortlisted for the Whitbread Biography Award. Summerscale has also judged various literary competitions, including the Booker Prize. Ira Mukhoty is the author of Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens and Begums of the Mughal Empire. Heroines, Powerful Indian Women in Myth and History, and her most recent book is the blockbuster Akbar, the Great Mughal, and she's currently working on a text around the women of the Mahabharata, due to be released later this year. Do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, The Haunting of ALMA Fielding, a true ghost story. Kate Summerscale in conversation with Ira Mukhoty.
Our podcast partner.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sanjoy. Welcome, Kate, to the 2021 JLF Literary Festival. I'm delighted to be here with you talking about your latest book, The Haunting of ALMA Fielding. It's a book that I really devoured in a very short sitting. Just to give the listeners a short idea about what it's all about, though Sanjoy gave us some idea. So it's set in the late 1930s in a pretty unassuming suburb of Croydon. And there's this woman who seems on the surface an unremarkable housewife from a working class neighborhood, but she's subject to poltergeist activity in her house. And she takes the step to try and find out what is happening to her. So when I was reading your book, I was struggling to sort of classify the genre that it would fall into, because it reads like a blockbuster. You want to keep knowing what happens next, and yet there's a lot of information. It's factual. So is it journalism? Is it history? Is it a crime, just a crime novel? What sort of stories would you say that you like to write, and how do you come about this process?
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted you enjoyed the book, and yes, I'm kind of interested in working in different genres at the same time. In a way, I love reading novels, and I love researching factual books. So that's the premise, really, that I research very deeply, and then I try to arrange the material that I find in a form that somehow resembles a novel, in that I use some of the techniques a novel writer might use, a novelist, which to do with sort of pacing and disclosure, basically the structure of the thing, and to try to, through research, have as rich a context as possible, so that you might know what the weather's like when things are happening, or what the neighbourhood looks like or even smells like. So I get all the material by research, but I want to involve the reader in an almost sensory way, and for it to be, at times at least, as immersive as fiction.
Right. But you do a lot of work in the archives as well. As you were saying, I think in an earlier interview, I heard you speaking, and you were talking about the rather serendipitous way in which you came across the archives for ALMA Fielding in Cambridge, I think it was. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Yes, I'm very drawn to obscure stories, lost stories that I can sort of dig up and tell, but there's always a certain amount of suspense involved in whether I'll find enough to work with, whether the story is going to be, there's going to be enough documentation to make it to play and make it live. So it was very exciting. I went to the story is about, as you said, a woman in the south of London who reports a poltergeist in her house, and the ghost hunter, who's a Hungarian immigrant called Nandor Fodor, who investigated the case and tried to establish whether she was telling the truth, and if so, what it meant, what the ghost was. And I read that the records of Fodor and his institute had been destroyed in the Second World War by bombing. So I didn't know how I was going to get at the substance of the case.
Exactly.
And I went to this archive in Cambridge because I saw a few references to him, that some of the files had material on him, and I was very interested in him. So I went to see what I could find, what fragments I could use to help me with the story. And to my amazement, there was the original file on this very case, the case I wanted to write about. And it had been wrongly labelled, and so it was slightly disguised, as it were, and I ordered it. Yeah, because I knew that Fodor had something to do with it, but no, it was this case, and all the notes were his, and it was full of X-rays, photographs, transcripts from seances, all this very juicy primary material.
Right. A wonderful moment for a writer of nonfiction, I must say.
Yes.
But can you tell us a little bit more about this whole movement, the spiritualist movement? I would have thought it more a phenomenon of the 19th century. I was very amazed to hear that in the late 1930s, people were heavily invested in paranormal activity, poltergeist activity, spiritualism. So what was happening, and what do you attribute this sort of, effervescence around this topic at that time?
Yes, I mean, same with me. I was really startled at how much interest there was in ghosts and the supernatural and telepathy between the wars. I'd been looking for a haunting, and I started by looking in the late 19th century. I wanted to write about a haunting, and I thought that was the moment. But it turned, I thought that actually the 1930s were a more surprising place to find a ghost. And there were two things that there were many things that fed into this particular poltergeist, but socially, sort of historically, I think it was both a legacy of the First World War, when so many Britons had died, and in the wake of the war, the seance circles really took off in Britain, with people trying to contact the dead. There's so many grieving mothers and fathers and wives and sweethearts. So there was that's what let the sort of spiritualist and supernatural interest take hold in Britain. But by 1938, there was something else also going on, which was that the newspapers were full of Hitler and Mussolini every day. There was a lot of dread about, everyone knew war was coming, and there were preparations being made to protect London from bombing. And again, this startled me a little, because it was a year and a half till the war actually broke out. But for a long time before, it was all over the news, and everyone was waiting. And of course, they knew that their sons, the women knew that their sons and husbands might again be called up and killed.
And what was interesting as well in the way in which you describe it is, we tend to think of ghosts, Victorian times, maybe wearing lacy gowns and wandering around insubstantially. But this poltergeist activity was surprisingly violent. You feel like the house was shaken up when you're describing it, the way the teacups go flying around. And I think Alma even cuts herself at some point, and there's blood and there are things breaking. It seems to be an upheaval almost of some sort, a violence taking place.
Yes, and in that sense too, it sort of relates to the fear of war. It's almost as if some of the things that the poltergeist was ricocheting around these suburban homes, breaking things, almost in a sort of forecast of the bombing, of the Blitz. Bombs coming in and destroying and breaking through this apparently banal and comforting domestic scene. It was very violent, and the poltergeists, it was a real 1930s phenomenon. They were reported often in the papers, and they were treated by the more establishment papers with a certain sniffiness. That they were seen as a slightly sort of working class phenomenon.
Right.
Whereas the old ghosts, the Victorian ghosts, would float about stately homes and castles in a rather dignified, eerie manner. These poltergeists were like gangsters or vandals. They were kind of crude and violent, and so that was an interesting thing to me too, to see the way that even through the supernatural, the sort of class distinctions and the judgments of one class on another, and the anxiety about the rise of the working class, I suppose, the aspirations of the working class between the wars, came through even in the commentary on the type of ghosts they had in their suburban homes.
Then is it safe to assume that we can make some sort of judgment about the fact that perhaps when you undergo a trauma of some sort, an abuse of some sort, if you're able to express it through, say, culture, art, or writing, or painting, that's one way to sublimate the entire process. But if a working class person, women especially, don't have access to that sort of outlet, perhaps, like I'm thinking of writers like Edward St. Aubyn, amongst many others, who've written about his childhood abuse and exorcised his demons by writing about it. But if women, especially working class women, don't have access to those modes of expression, could that be a reason why we saw a lot of this sort of phenomenon happening in those classes, and women especially?
Yes, I think so. I think I came to think, as in a way, to some extent, Fodor did, in the way that he interpreted the ghosts, and especially poltergeists he came across, that they were forms of self-expression. And he noticed that they often issued from unhappy homes, and there was often that unspoken trouble and hurt and trauma in these families. And I think I did come to think of the poltergeist insofar as it in some way as a kind of piece of performance art, that it was a way in which the only available way, most of the people involved in the supernatural and the spiritual world were women, and they were performing their pain in a way, whether in seances or in poltergeist attacks. They were giving voice to alternate selves, to often childlike selves. So a poltergeist you could think of as a gangster, but you could also think of as an angry toddler, a child in a rage who had not previously been able to, who was not given any other voice. And so I was very curious about the fact that in these Alma Fielding, who is poltergeist I investigated like Fodor, was she was sort of a working class woman, not very highly educated, lived a very limited though comfortable life, and I imagined that, yes, she did try writing things and drawing things, but she had no training or sophistication in those things, whereas the poltergeist got her a tremendous amount of attention and acclaim, really. She became somebody special, and people were listening to her, they were hanging on her every word.
She called up the papers herself, didn't she? I mean, I was surprised to hear that when she experienced this activity, she went to the papers to tell them about it, isn't it?
Yes, I was surprised and a little bit skeptical to hear that. It sounded like attention seeking. But however, the papers were all over these stories,
Okay.
and the Sunday Pictorial, which is the paper she contacted, had been running a series in which every week they invited readers to get in touch and tell them if they had any supernatural experiences. And here she was having a live ghost poltergeist in her house. I guess that in the cultural context of the time, she wouldn't have gone to the police. She wouldn't have gone to a psychiatrist. She went to the place which seemed to have a respect and interest for these kinds of stories, which was the popular press. And they zoomed round. You know, they were round at her house within hours. 2 reporters. And the story was on the front page of the paper the next day.
Wow.
So she was right in identifying who would be interested and who would listen to her. Yeah.
And in terms of objects, I found them really fascinating. This is a cover of your book. I'm afraid it's on Kindle. And there are lots of fascinating objects that are very important in different ways. And one of them you show, I think, is a perfume bottle, because there's so much crockery flying around the house all the time. So many objects, you know, costume jewelry and glasses of all sorts. And you mentioned that it's a working class neighborhood. Nonetheless, there seem to be a lot of material objects which can be broken, you know. So what are your thoughts on that, and how do you think that came about?
Yeah, that was pretty astonishing. When Fodor went round to see what damage the poltergeist had done in the house on his first visit, we did a kind of inventory of what had been damaged, and there was something like 36 wine glasses and a whole lot of tumblers, sauce cups and saucers. Oh my God, every time anyone had a cup of tea, it seemed to sort of explode and hit the ceiling. And yes, lots of like trinkets and things from Alma's dressing table, ornaments. And I did think, my God, this house is just stuffed with things. And then I had to revise my sense of, although they were definitely a working class family, Les, who was a builder and decorator, was obviously doing quite well and bringing in the money. And they were able to buy all these things that were adornments as well as, you know, useful objects. And then I got to thinking about how much dusting that would have entailed, how much looking after all this stuff required. And it gave me almost a sense of the claustrophobia of living in this sort of environment, where you've got all this display of affluence, working class affluence, and yet all of it is just an endless kind of round of cleaning the hearth and getting more logs in and getting the coal and dusting everything that would have been covered with, you know, dust from the coal, and cleaning and washing and so actually the tedium that all these objects entailed, and the lack of sort of modern appliances with which to deal with it all, gave me a sense of, if Alma was involved either consciously, unconsciously, or supernaturally in creating this chaos and destruction in her house, I had a sense of the sort of anger and frustration that might drive it, just like a woman just smashing up her stuff, you know, like wanting out or wanting change, wanting transformation, because she was hurting herself as well, as you mentioned. Sometimes she would get cut and she'd get a gash from a smashed teacup or saucer or whatever, get hit in the head. And it felt quite sort of dangerous, reckless stuff going on. And she definitely, although she called the papers and then signed up with this Supernatural Institute for tests, she doesn't seem to have been in it for the money. She didn't need the money, you know, as we can tell from all these objects. And so I was very curious, like, if she was fraudulent, like, why? What did she want here? And why was all her stuff getting smashed up?
Exactly. So since we're talking about the investigative process, tell us a little more about Nando Fodor. He's also a fascinating character, an outsider in a way. He's an immigrant. He's a Jewish Romanian, I think. So he comes with his own baggage. And I believe initially he really wanted for this to be a proper case of a poltergeist activity. He really wanted to believe, as Scully would have said in the X-Files. So what was his background? What did he bring to the case, and how did he approach ALMA?
Well, he was trained as a lawyer, then became a journalist in New York. He left his native Budapest for New York and then came to England. And he was fascinated by the supernatural. And at first it was a hobby, but when he got to London, he's working for Lord Rothermere, he got himself a job as chief ghost hunter at the International Institute for Psychical Research, which meant he was paid to do his ghost hunting, and he was absolutely thrilled. He's like a little boy just longing to find a ghost, proof of a ghost, and loving all the stories that came into the Institute about ghosts. And he's just, to me, he was a sort of enchanting character because he's in some ways very wide-eyed and longing to believe, and in other ways quite sort of irrational and skeptical. So he wasn't prepared to take anything on trust. He wanted to find a ghost, but he wanted to prove it. You know, he wanted evidence, and he put people to the test if they had a ghost. And he wanted evidence, which was lovely for me as a researcher because his files are stuffed full of these sort of attempts at gathering evidence, photographs and diagrams and transcripts. And he developed a sort of strange relationship, an intriguing relationship with Alma Fielding, because he became obsessed with the idea that here was the woman he'd been looking for, who would give him the evidence of the supernatural, the greatest medium ever, you know, the psychic, because she proved able to sort of produce things from thin air as the investigation progressed. But he also was quite hard on her and trying to trick her and trap her and catch her out, because he wanted to be really sure that the things that she was saying and doing were genuine. And so it's a sort of love-hate relationship, and it had a slightly erotic frisson to it as well. The two of them working together on trying to prove the existence of the poltergeist over several months in 1938. So he was very always eager to believe and discover things, and he provided a kind of guide or handrail for me because he was an investigator, and when I got sort of discouraged or disillusioned, I tried to take heart from his great enthusiasm and his sort of generosity of spirit, because he didn't just want to find out about fraud and reality. He also wanted to find out, even if somebody was fraudulent, what lay behind it, what story they were trying to tell. So I tried to take inspiration from him in that sense, in remembering that this wasn't really a story about do ghosts exist or not. It was a story about what do people use ghosts to tell about themselves and about the world they live in the same way as somebody, as you said, might use a painting or a novel or a piece of music if they were trained in a different way.
Exactly. And you talk about, I mean, in the background at one stage, Freud is, I think, slowly dying at this stage, and he eventually gets a copy of Fodor's work, in his hands. So we do have, at the same time where all this paranormal activity and poltergeist activity is happening, you're having some pretty advanced theories around psychoanalysis, fragmented personalities, all these ideas beginning to be accepted as well. And Fodor is sort of at the cusp of these two worlds, and he's able to bring this knowledge into Alma's life and maybe understand her a little better.
Yes, he was sort of a pioneer in the world of psychical research, in trying to apply the ideas of Freud and other psychoanalysts to ghosts and to people who experienced ghosts and saw ghosts. And but this made Fodor rather a contentious figure even within his own institute, where most of the people who were members of the Institute, were spiritualists who believed that ghosts were not only genuine, but genuinely the spirits of the dead, and that they were the returning dead. They were individuals who were coming back with messages for those on Earth. And Fodor was starting to believe, the more he researched, the more he encountered people who had seen ghosts, he was starting to believe that ghosts actually came from within us, within the living, and that they were, even if they were genuine supernormal phenomena, that they were projections of internal human states, not people returning from the other side. And this set him at odds with his colleagues. But so, yeah, the Freudian ideas took him into very controversial territory in the psychical world, and he had to tread carefully. And indeed, eventually, the Institute expelled him.
Sorry, a slight technical issue. I think I've lost Kate here momentarily. I think she had a slightly unstable connection, and I'm sure she'll be back soon.
Hello.
Welcome back, Kate.
Oh, sorry, it just disappeared, but I'm glad to be back. Not too long.
We just lost you when you said that Fodor had been sacked from his institute.
Yes, when his colleagues discovered what his theories were, his very radical theories about Alma's poltergeist and how it issued from a trauma in her childhood, they were disgusted and appalled, and they sacked him. I mean, from his job as chief ghost hunter, and he was then he was very angry and upset, not least because he couldn't finish the investigation. But he wrote up his notes so far, and he discovered that Freud was in London, had come to London, had fled Nazi-occupied Vienna. And as you say, he was very ill, Freud. It turned out to be the last year of his life. But he agreed to read Fodor's manuscript, and he essentially endorsed it. And since Freud was Fodor's great hero, this was, he was overjoyed. And he sent a copy of Freud's letter to the Institute that had fired him, with no covering note or anything, he felt vindicated, and that and he then, Fodor eventually went to New York and became a psychoanalyst. So that part of his work, his interest in the workings of the human mind as opposed to the discarnate beings of spiritualism, sort of took over. And but he spent, even in New York as a psychoanalyst, he especially liked patients who were haunted people, who had had supernatural experiences.
And even Alma's life seems to take a turn for the better once she has had this long and rigorous process with Nandor. She does seem to go, she does earn a little bit of money from the fact that she, takes part in these experiments. She gets to leave the house twice a week, I think, to regularly meet with these people, educated, interesting people who take an interest in her. And then she goes on, it seems, to have a slightly freer life after all this is put behind her.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, so Fodor left London in 1939, and the war broke out later that year, and Alma and her husband Les and their son went to live in the countryside on a cliff. And it does seem as if from then on, she lived in a much simpler house with less stuff. It was just a little bungalow. And her husband seemed to have given her a lot of freedom. So she even lived with another man in London at one point after the war.
Wow.
She was given a lot of independence, and maybe something had been addressed and resolved through that encounter with Fodor and the other people at the Institute. It had in the end proved an escape from her life that was kind of enduring. And the things that he said to her, I mean, it was in a way a very roughshod, strange kind of psychotherapy she underwent,
Yes.
where he would, she had that kind of fierce psychotherapeutic attention, as well as the rather unnerving scrutiny of her body and her actions for deceit. And so it was a very sort of ramped up, intense experience, but perhaps one that gave her some sense of her troubles and the conflicts inside her having been understood.
Right.
And it does feel as if something that was exploding in her at the beginning of 90, that she found something, some sort of peace with herself and within marriage.
Just a last question before we go to audience questions. Since we were talking earlier on about these movements, these paranormal activities that happen often at a time of great national stress or, war and such like. After the year we've had with this pandemic and lockdowns, do you think we might see a resurgence then of people believing in these sort of activities, or how else do you think they might convey their repressed truth?
Yes, I think there is a little bit of evidence. Even before the pandemic, it was a sort of turbulent world we felt ourselves to be in, and there's been a lot of a resurgence in interest in fortune telling, which is another characteristic of a troubled time, and that was going on before the Second World War too, very much so. So, tarot cards and various horoscopes, various kinds of ways of seeing the future. And I read an article in the New York Times last year about a paranormal researcher, a ghost hunter there, who they'd interviewed, who said during the first lockdowns, when the pandemic broke out and people were confined to their homes, there was a huge rise in reports of haunted houses and poltergeists. People were seeing things move, finding things, strange noises around the place. And so, I mean, partly, of course, just because they're in this one space and there's nothing else to pay attention to, perhaps. Right. But also, I think it exactly attests to the same sort of the phenomenon where there's a kind of jumpiness and dread in the air. You find things to attach it to. You find ways of telling that story about your internal state.
Right, exactly. Wonderful. Well, let's go to the first question, which is from Kabir, who asks, what is the difference between paranormal and supernatural fiction? Would it be okay to tag your book supernatural even after reading about cups flying?
Yes, well, that's interesting. The word paranormal came into use after the Second World War. People didn't use it in the 1930s, but they did use supernormal, and the psychical researchers preferred that. They saw it as a more scientific term because it left open the possibility that this was something, that it wasn't the returning dead, but something, kinetic energies that were natural that we just didn't yet understand. Right. So I think paranormal is probably an inheritor of that idea of the supernormal, which is kind of open-minded about the source of the weird phenomena, whereas supernatural does imply something closer to what the spiritualists believed about ghosts and another world. So I think Fodor would have considered himself studying the supernormal, therefore the paranormal, I suppose, in modern parlance. Yeah.
Right. And having spent so much time with Alma Fielding's case yourself, what do you think? Do you think there was any element of supernormal activity at all? I mean, there were cases where she was clearly fabricating some of the stuff, but not all of it. So what is your take on it, having spent so long on her?
I don't know. There are things that happened that, as you say, were clearly fraudulent. So my skeptical nature leads me to think, well, maybe there were ways in which even the inexplicable things were engineered in some way by her. Mm-hmm. And yet the truth is there were many things that were never explained and can't be. And this is often the case, you know, in the world. And I can't go back and investigate firsthand. So I can only take the word of those who were there. I hope that the book leaves it open, and depending on what your level of skepticism is, you will interpret the story differently. Which is not to say the story is completely open-ended. I think we learn a lot of things, and I think that actually what emerges is that isn't the key question, did it happen? The key question is, why did whatever happen? Mm-hmm. But of course, it's the thing that drives the investigation, and it sort of drives the narrative at various points. So there's a sort of tension between which thing are we trying to find out? You know, is it about the supernormal or is it about the psychological? And depending on your predisposition and your own experience as a person, you will work differently through that, I think.
Right. And Kavya asks, do you believe your ancestors are watching you, or maybe Alma Fielding watching and controlling you when you were researching?
No, I don't believe that. I don't believe that that Alma was controlling me while I was researching. And yet, I think it's part of the process of writing about real people that you try to sort of get under their skin. You try to do something that is a little bit like what a medium does in a seance, which is let them inhabit you and speak through you, and you try to imagine being them. And that's what my books are, in a way, is trying to imagine. I am trying to imagine myself back into another time and into other people's lives. And so metaphorically, I'm definitely trying to induce a kind of possession. I think it's metaphorical. I don't fear that the actual spirits of the dead are with me, or hope. Maybe it should be hope, but I don't believe that. But I understand, I come close to it because to research well and to write well, you have to sort of surrender yourself to a certain kind of fantasy of imaginative closeness and belief.
A possession of some sort, after all.
Yeah.
So Anmol asks, we have covered this early on. He says, like other supernatural events of the 30s, your book too is an expression of national as well as personal dread. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, I think that that's what. When I went to visit Alma's grandson, who I found living in the west of England, he showed me some papers that he'd inherited, and among them was a photocopy of the page from the Sunday Pictorial in which the poltergeist story was reported. And right next to the story was a picture of Hitler shouting, and underneath a news story about the fact he was due to make an important speech that day. And it was that image really that that sort of electrified me. I thought, oh my God, of course, you know, there is a connection here between different types of fear and dread. Right. And the poltergeist story was in a way it was a distraction from anxiety. It was a bit of weirdness and fun, a sort of gossipy, you know, but it was also an expression of anxiety, a kind of domestic enactment of the anxiety that people might be feeling on seeing these headlines and these images. And the more I look, the more poltergeists I found, especially in 1938. And it seemed to me kind of clear that there was a connection between the national mood and the rise of this particular form of supernatural activity.
Which is why the historical setting was so important for this book. It just would not have made the same sort of sense if we didn't have this in the backdrop and know what was happening, with the rise of fascism. Linda asks, what keeps the supernatural element from taking over?
Well, I think my very strong curiosity about people's sort of physical lives and the immediate environments. I was interested as much in the type of teacups that were broken or the shape of the perfume bottle as the ghost itself. So I think that very retaining a sort of concrete attention to detail and texture and daily life and thinking this some level really happened, and to stay in touch with that, and that the historical is what stops it from becoming too sort of vague and amorphous and what if and possibility. I mean, it's non-fiction, so everything had to be grounded in evidence, and that stops you from going off the rails too much in terms of imaginative, ghostly apparitions.
Maya asks, after researching and writing about Alma Fielding, would you agree one's suppressed feelings erupt in supernatural violence?
Yes, I think that was the idea that Fodor was exploring, and I found it fascinating and persuasive. And the more I looked at his notes and the transcripts of what Alma had said and the other people involved also, I noticed that many of the women around him had suffered, the mediums and psychics around him. There was a woman called Eileen Garrett, for example, who seemed to have had some kind of abuse as a child, and both her parents killed themselves when she was a baby, and then she lost, I think, 3 sons to meningitis. I mean, the trauma this woman experienced, and then she became like the greatest medium in England in the 30s. And I thought there was just an undeniable link between the desire of certain women to express types of grief that it was difficult to find expression for, and types of confusion and contradiction. And this idea of channeling the voices of the dead, or being able to see into the minds of other people, these highly sensitized women, I think that often had endured these extraordinarily difficult experiences, and so I did find the idea supported by lots of the stories that I came across, not just Alma's.
Right. Well, that's all we have time for in this session. Thank you so much, Kate Summerscale, for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, Sanjoy Roy, and the entire team of JLF. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate Summerscale, Ira Mukhoty. That was absolutely fascinating. My experience with ghosts started at the age of 7 when I saw my first sort of spirit, so to speak. A sort of disembodied arm sort of flash across the mosquito curtain. This was fantastic. Thank you to our celebration partners, Diageo, and thank you all for watching, being such a great audience. Please stay logged on as we continue to watch with us. And do remember to go to the Darbar Hall sessions as well. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic. And while we braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we continue to struggle. We hope you can help us by contributing. Do so now. Please don't forget to tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021. Our handles are at Jaipur Litfest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Stay safe.
To all storytellers and story lovers, my name is Laksh Datta. I host and produce the Jaipur Bites podcast, where you can hear many of the amazing sessions from the Jaipur Literature Festival. I also produce a few other podcasts, as you can see right here. English, Hindi, fiction, non-fiction. If you see something you like, maybe you can take a screenshot of this right now. I'll give you a second. and tune in later. Find them on your favorite podcast app.
For those of you who've always dreamt of being in the sun-soaked environment of the Maldives and just basking there in its beautiful, pristine, emerald green atolls, and for those of you who've traveled the world following the Jaipur Literature Festival and JLF, well, here is an occasion where we bring both together. JLF goes to Suneva Fushi 3rd to the 12th of September 2021. Here's a chance for you to come and meet with your favorite authors, dine on some